We're at the point where Guy Wesley Reffitt is being sentenced, and the Department of Justice submitted a document, a sentencing document that was 58 pages long, their recommendations and request for sentencing. Now, this is Matthew Graves. It is the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. It is his office. And the U.S. prosecutor who it works for Matthew Graves is his boss. The one who submitted this sentencing document, his name is Jeffrey Nessler. Jeffrey Nessler works directly under Matthew Graves. This is what Jeffrey Nessler wrote in this sentencing document. He wrote, the court should depart upward under USSG 3A1.4, terrorism, because Reffitt's conviction for obstructing Congress's certification of the Electoral College vote was, quote, calculated to influence or affect the conduct of government by intimidation or coercion. Okay, now that sounds pretty bad. So let's look at what he actually did. Let's look at what Guy Wesley Reffitt actually did. So he traveled to Washington, D.C. for January 6th. He traveled with one other person. He actually never entered the Capitol building at all, ever. Not the entire day. He didn't enter it at all. After he returned home, several days later, he bragged about what he had done. He bragged about being part of the January 6th protests. He bragged about it to his son, and his son captured that on video. And it's actually that video that prosecutors are using to accuse him of not being remorseful and not understanding how serious the infraction that he committed was. And they're asking the court to sentence him to 15 years in prison on the basis that they say he played a central role in leading a mob that attacked the United States Capitol. Now, again, Guy Wesley Reffitt might have said things on video that were distasteful. He might have done things that are not advisable to do, but he never entered the Capitol building, ever. He didn't set one foot in the Capitol building. He did not attempt the kidnapping of a member of Congress. He did not attempt to seize any sort of government building or federal property. He brought no weapon of mass destruction, nor did he plan to use one. He committed no arson, no vandalism, no destruction of federal property. He did not attempt to harm or kill a member of Congress. He didn't even plan to harm or kill a member of Congress. All of those elements are elements that are an element of a crime of terror, are elements of domestic terrorism. And he engaged in none of that. And yet Matthew Graves' office is asking for Guy Wesley Reffitt to be sentenced to 15 years in prison on the basis of committing a terror act, even though the guy didn't enter the Capitol. This is what the document says. The terrorism enhancement is applicable where a defendant acts according to a plan, whether developed over a long period of time or developed in a span of seconds, with the object of influencing government conduct or retaliating against a government. So let's break this down for a second. First of all, influencing government conduct is our fundamental constitutional right. We are allowed to redress or petition our government for a redress of grievances. We're allowed to criticize government employees. We're certainly allowed to try to influence our members of Congress as they vote for things which impact us. Does that mean that you can threaten violence, or you can bribe, or you can coerce, you can blackmail? No, of course not. But you can, and in fact you should, make your voice heard in an attempt to influence the people in Congress who are there to represent you. So the idea that if you engage in some kind of activity with the object of influencing government conduct, that is a crime, that's actually really scary stuff. That's borderline, not even borderline. If this were to be a conviction, this would be a blatant violation of our First Amendment rights to criticize our government. The other part of this sentence that's really scary is where a defendant acts according to a plan, this document reads, whether developed over a long period of time or developed in a span of seconds. Developed in a span of seconds. What does that even mean? What does that even mean? So if you're walking along and you have an idea for something and you just turn to the right instead of turning to the left, that counts as the same as conspiring to commit an act where you've planned for weeks and weeks? I don't think so. This is an attempt to turn January 6th defendants, some of whom broke the law, some of whom entered restricted grounds, some of whom entered the Capitol when they weren't supposed to, some of whom protested in an area where they were not allowed to do so. But it's an attempt to turn that nonviolent infraction into domestic terrorism. Now, if this sounds familiar, it's because the Department of Homeland Security it is familiar. The Department of Homeland Security has tried to label Trump-supporting parents who are against critical race theory and queer theory being indoctrinated into their children's minds in public schools, labeled them as domestic terrorists too. This is part of the Biden administration's larger agenda, is to label you and I, anybody who questions the radical leftist ideology, anyone who tries to counter their political policies, anybody who speaks even words on social media that the left doesn't like, as an actual literal terrorist in the eyes of the law. They go on to say, the U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia, the prosecutor, goes on to say the crimes that Reffitt and others like him committed on January 6th are unprecedented. These crimes defy statutorily appropriate comparisons to other obstructive-related conduct in other cases. To try to mechanically compare other defendants prior to January 6, 2021 would be a disservice to the magnitude of what the riot entailed and signified. Oh, dear Lord. Oh, dear Lord, this is literally an admission from Jeffrey Nessler, the federal prosecutor who works for Matthew Graves, the U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia, that this is all about politics. This is just politics. This is his political opinion that the magnitude of what the riot entailed and signified. What on God's green earth does that mean? Let's break that down. A disservice to the magnitude of what the riot entailed and signified. So in the eyes of the left, what the riot signified was Trump supporters' dissatisfaction with how election integrity was conducted, the electioneering of the 2020 presidential election. It's not even a question. It's not even an allegation. We know that the left electioneered. We know that the left that the left had universal mail-in ballots, had unattended drop boxes, degraded the quality of signature verification to make sure that there was no voter fraud. We know that these things happen, and we know that in many states, the Wisconsin Supreme Court literally said these unattended drop boxes are against Wisconsin state law. And the people who in various states, not just Wisconsin, the politicians or the bureaucrats in these states that conducted this electioneering had no authority to make these rule changes. The state legislatures have to do that, and the state legislatures didn't. It was people who had no authority to make these changes, and the changes were in violation of state law. This electioneering is unquestionable. It's not an allegation. It's not an opinion. It happened. It's reality. But according to the U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia, who's prosecuting these January 6th defendants, trying to turn them into domestic terrorism, the magnitude of what the riot signified makes comparisons to any other activity, any other action that would be the same action. You can't make that comparison, they say. These crimes defy statutorily appropriate comparisons. What he's saying is he doesn't want you to notice that while the U.S. attorney, the Biden Department of Justice really is prosecuting January 6th participants, trying to turn them into terrorists, he doesn't want you to notice that at the same time they're letting Stephen Colbert and his nine insurrectionists off, that they dropped the charges. He doesn't want you to notice that while January 6th defendants have been in prison for a year and facing 15-year prison sentences, the protesters, the pro-abortion protesters outside of Brett Kavanaugh's home, were breaking the literal same law. It is against the law to protest outside of a Supreme Court justice's home with the intent to influence the Supreme Court justice's opinion on a particular ruling. And to use intimidation and coercion and threats of violence. And that's what those protesters are doing. And the Biden administration did not and had no intention of ever holding them to account, even though the law required that they do so.